message. Today, we're really pleased to have as our speaker Ronald Boyd-MacMillan, who is senior fellow at the International Institute for Religious Freedom and a research associate at OCMS, where he's finishing a book provisionally entitled An Answer to My Enemies, the Theology, History, and Spirituality of the Suffering Church. This is a follow-up to the one of his previous books, Faith That Endures, an essential guide to the persecuted church, published by Revell in 2006. He has 40 years of interaction with the persecuted communities around the world as journalist, teacher, and strategist. He holds a B.Sc from Bristol University, an M.Div from Fuller Seminary, and a Ph.D in Practical Theology from the University of Aberdeen. He is adjunct professor at Fuller and visiting professor of Practical Theology at the Lahore College of Theology, Pakistan, where he is also ordained in the Diocese of Raiwind. Currently, he is president of a speech tuition agency offering training to top-level leaders in business and is based in the Cotswolds, England. And so with that, I will turn it over to you, Rod, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Tom. I wanted to deal with this area of how persecution creeps into cultures and how we should respond. It's part of the book that I'm doing. It's technically under the section which is to do with influencing. There's a first section that's to do with the biblical or the theology of persecution. A second section looks into the history of persecution, showing that actually in the long term, persecution can kill the church if it lasts long enough. And that's important to tap into the historical story. Then there's a contemporary story. Then there's the influencing, and then there's the final section is the spirituality of the persecuted church. That is, the hazards as well as the blessings of being a persecuted Christian, because it's not always an easy thing to be persecuted. And you have occupational hazards, for example, legalism, which is a very common issue in persecuted communities. But this time it's to do with the influencing area. And I've titled it Built First with Words. It was Ernest Hemingway was once asked, how did you go bankrupt? And he replied in his trademark laconic way, gradually, then suddenly. And it's the same, I would say, with persecution. It comes gradually and then suddenly. Even if you wake up one day and it's a very different situation, for example, in 1979, if you were a Christian in Tehran, nevertheless, that was a situation that had been quite a long time coming. And I first became aware of this very strongly and powerfully when I made a visit to Auschwitz, Birkenau. I was traveling in Poland, and at the time the camp had been pretty much left as it was. It hasn't got this fancy and rather beautiful visiting center that it has now. It was still a horrible experience, especially to see that room where the spectacles are piled over 100 feet high, and you realize just, the chronic and terrible waste of life. And attached, there was only about 4 visitors that whole day, and one of them was an old rabbi. And he showed me his stamp. He'd been in another camp, not Auschwitz. And he was very keen to grip my hand and say, young man, he said, you must remember these crematoria were not built with bricks first. They were built with words. He said, long before one brick was laid on another, we Jews were the butts of jokes. There were campaigns against us, slogans, articles. He said it came very gradually, started in the 20s. the anti-Semitism took over the culture until we were dehumanized and depersonalized. And he said, after that happens, you can do anything you like to an animal. And so he said, just remember, they were built first with words. And we always think in some ways that we believe we'll see it coming. But very often persecution, creeps into society before it erupts into it. And many Christians lose their freedom before they realize it. And of course, there's a famous quote from Martin Niemöller. He was the pastor of the Confessing Church, very famous Christian in Nazi Germany. And he had indeed been a submarine commander in the First World War. And he was not a Nazi, of course, stood out against the Nazi ideology. And he famously said, after the whole debacle had taken place, he said, first they came for the socialists. I'm going to try and move my things over because I can't see there. Is that easier for you?
Put on the single view one there, unless you want to see everybody.
I mean, I just can't see the whole thing because the little screen is on there. It says, first they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists. I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. And I remember at Cambridge talking to Owen Chadwick, who knew very well the master of Selwyn College. And he said the master of Selwyn College had Hitler's picture on his desk until 1938. He said because he made the trains run on time, the parks were safe to walk in for women. It looked from afar like Hitler was doing a good job. And it was only 1938 that he rather shamefacedly removed the picture, and it became clear. So why do we do this method of trying to come up with a 7-element model for persecution? What did you say I should do with this? Just that one, because then that hides everything completely, doesn't it? Yes, it is. Yeah, allegedly. So a 7-element model of how persecution creeps into cultures. Why bother trying this sort of thing? Well, in one way, it's to try to properly diagnose the kind of full range of persecution dynamics that are in play. And that includes factors, that seem initially unconnected. For example, the Nazis would not have got power without the Wall Street crash in 1929, which created the hyperinflation through which they were enabled to sweep to the center of power. So, you have to look at this larger view. And the other thing is it's quite practical because we teach this methodology to a group of leaders of, say, a persecuted community in order to discern where their activism should focus in order to make the greatest difference. So we have this idea of a 7-element model, which I want to try to explain and just get your thoughts about. I talk about how there's basically a vacuum in which a situation emerges where the extremists get an opportunity to move to the center of power. Extremists do not triumph unless moderates fail. This seems to be the story, and we must do, and as long as there's a vacuum, it feeds the other elements that are required to take extremists to the center of power. I talk about there needs to be a villain who's a kind of architect of the strategy. They have to form a movement. They have to mint a lie. A lie gets the mob going. The mob creates the chaos. They need to control the megaphone, which is basically the messaging. And if they stay in power for a longer period, they then try to embed their particular extremism into legislation, into laws. And so the idea of looking at each of these is to figure out, when we come to do strategy about it, is to shrink the vacuum so that these individual elements are isolated and then they can be more easily picked off. You can't really deal with, for example, a message of extremism if the vacuum is fueling it all the time. The vacuum needs to be detached from the individual elements, but I'll talk about this as we go. Here's the idea of the vacuum from where it kind of starts. A vacuum is a situation in society where something happens, or a series of events, that creates a crisis of such severity that people tend to give up on the forces of moderation, and they entertain or they acquiesce to extremist solutions they wouldn't otherwise consider. And of course, it represents a fairly major meltdown of societal coherence. It creates a desperation to try remedies that are normally unpalatable, particularly to voters, because this can happen, remember, in democracies or semi-democracies. I always remember in the early 1990s sitting down with a man called L.K. Advani. And Advani was the basic architect of Hindu extremism in India. And this was at a time when only 2 members of the BJP had a seat in the parliament. The BJP were a bit of a joke. But Advani was at work with his strategy, and he had created a system, I may say a little bit more about it as we go, to realize that a vacuum was opening up in India that could be exploited. It was things like, for example, the Congress Party was hopelessly corrupt. And people were really fed up with it. It had been in power really since the beginning of independence. Another thing was that actually in India at that time, what happened was that the regional parties started to have a lot more power. And therefore it became, the Congress had less and less power to control the different regions. And there were other areas too. For example, of course, in 1991, Congress really had a kind of left-wing ideology. And after the fall of the wall, that kind of disappeared. And in places like Calcutta and so on, there was a very strong left-wing idea. It disappeared. And so there was an opportunity for a new ideology to come into this. There was a vacuum. Someone like Advani was very conscious of it and was able to exploit it. As I say, it's often the result of an external destabilization that can come from a very long way off. I was giving the example of the Wall Street crash in 1929 that had a major impact, really, on the rise of the Nazis. In fact, Hitler wouldn't have taken power if Wall Street had not crashed. I think we can say that with complete certainty. It also involves an unprecedented opportunity for extremists and their solutions or proposed solutions to move to the center of society. It gives them a kind of legitimacy. And people, as I say, will try this. I mean, all throughout the 1920s, the Nazis were a joke in Germany. But it really took the events of the early 1930s to bring them to the center. It can have a class dimension. There's a lot of work on this in revolutionary studies, particularly from a more Marxist perspective. But it is very important to talk about that the middle classes, in many ways, are key in this regard. And if they lose their desire to uphold legitimate institutions, it's very dangerous. And for example, Mao Zedong considerably took power in China because Chiang Kai-shek ran away with the savings of the middle classes. And if Chiang Kai-shek had not done that, the middle classes would not have given up on him. But to lose that group is in many ways absolutely critical. So just to give you an example of a vacuum, we remember the rise of ISIS. Fortunately, they're not the power they were, but they actually controlled a huge area of Syria and Iraq, larger than Wales, for about 5 years. And to give you an example of how a vacuum works in practice, on the June, I think it was June 14th, 2014, 1,300 ISIS fighters attacked the city of Mosul. There were 65,000 Iraqi soldiers to repel them. In 3 days, all 65,000 had run away, led in the first instance by their commander. He was first out. In other words, in a very real sense, and people really got this who were watching this, ISIS never really fought many battles. They just kept walking in, and the opposition kept melting away. And there's a very good reason for this. If you look at the nature of this vacuum, the civil war in Syria, of course, following the Arab Spring of 2010, Assad refused to engage with ISIS because he wanted to show the West what they would get if they didn't back him. It suited him to let ISIS have control of an area. Then, of course, we had the waning of what is called the Pax Americana. At this time, America, the country that really matters the most still to most countries in the world, was taking a period there where they were a bit fed up with the Middle East because they had engaged in Afghanistan and they had engaged in Iraq, and it had not been very successful. And so also, of course, in America, they had really pushed on the fracking side of things. So they were no longer so dependent on Middle Eastern oil. So there was a sense really in the policy elite in the Beltway to say, oh, you go sort your problems out, we're fed up with this. And so they were not so keen to get involved anymore for this period. Regional powers could have stepped in, Turkey, Iran, Saudi, but actually they wanted a buffer zone because they didn't really want to fight each other. Well, ISIS occupied that buffer zone. There were decades of Wahhabism, of course, from Saudi Arabia that had radicalized many of the members of ISIS. And of course, there's also the actions of the Shia majority in Iraq under Nur al-Maliki. They were very corrupt. And the Sunni tribes really in northern Iraq aligned themselves with ISIS very quickly because they were so fed up with the rule of the Shia. So for all these reasons, therefore, ISIS had a vacuum. And but just because there's a vacuum doesn't mean that extremists take power. You have to have these other elements. And I'm suggesting that these are the other elements too. One is a villain, or you could put it more carefully and say, well, an architect, you know, a leader who has the opportunity to take power thanks to the vacuum. He or she sees the opportunity, and they're usually a demagogue. Sometimes they're an organizer. That's al-Baghdadi. He was the head of ISIS, and he was a brilliant organizer. But he's the architect who comes up with this strategy to take power. And he split, of course, famously from Al-Qaeda. And he basically said, no, jihadism means that you have to kill other Muslims as well. And this was the idea that he really pushed. And so they were much more violent even than Al-Qaeda. So kill all infidels, and that includes Muslims. That was a new idea. Al-Baghdadi came up with it, and he wrote this idea. Other villains, you know, are obvious. I remember meeting, as I say, Advani said to me rather unguardedly in 1992, he said, well, I'm looking at the Christians of India. He said, I see that they have an influence that's quite out of proportion to their numbers. They're 2.3% of the population officially. And yet they have, you know, 80% of the hospitals, 50% of the schools, all this kind of thing. And he says, I've decided that it's because they're one. He said, they have one book. He said, we have so many texts. He said, they have one God. We have, 33 million and counting. And he said, but they're also one church. I don't think he looked terribly closely, but he said they're one church. And so he decided to remake Hindu extremism in that they one God. They would talk about Ram more than any other. They would have one book. They would talk about the Bhagavad Gita more than the other. And he would discipline all the different units like the VHP, the Bajrang Dal, and so on. And he made them run together. And so Advani was the architect, really, of Hindu extremism in India. Modi has got a different strategy. And he has added populism to Hindutva. And that has played very well with the OBCs, the other backward castes. But a villain never succeeds alone. A disciplined movement of support has to be built or hijacked. Sometimes it doesn't necessarily have to be the one the villain takes over. And so you have to recruit specialists, you have to run rackets, you have to train fighters, you have to indoctrinate followers, you have to purchase arms, you have to spread lies. Baghdadi was a phenomenal organizer in this respect. They would publish accounts every year of where the money was coming from. They taxed everybody from the humble vegetable seller. They had a big kidnapping racket. And of course, they had an arrangement with Turkey to sell oil all the time. And so they were actually raking in something in the region of 20 to 30 million a week, which kept them going. And so, he was smart this way. There's a literature on this, and it seems to boil down to that if you want an effective movement, certainly an extremist movement, you need, first of all, an outside source of funding. If you take Boko Haram, in northern Nigeria, they actually get a lot of money from Saudi and Qatar, a lot of money. But they also have, kidnapping rackets and so on. But you need also a good supply of unemployed youth, because these are your fighters. And basically, you need a society where the 17 to 24-year-olds, mostly male, but there is a lot of female fighters too, basically don't have education or a job. And if there's a big group, that's ripe for extremist recruitment. And in fact, if you look at megatrends from someone like PricewaterhouseCoopers or the McKinsey Institute, they're warning us that from now until 2030, there will be 266 million more youth in the world, mostly in the sub-Saharan African area, who will probably neither get a job or an education. 266 million over the next 8 years. Now, that is a perfect storm for extremist recruitment. I don't know why ministries are not making that strategically number one. There's not a bigger game in some ways than that. And the third thing, of course, you need is an incompetent government. Because, in Latin America, for example, in Colombia, half the countryside is not run by the government. It's run by the cartels or the guerrilla movements, because the government basically hasn't got the resources to control the country. This was a little work that was done in Pakistan of jihadist organizations, and you can see that they're very, very organized, top officials, commanders, and of course they have the suicide bombers at the bottom. They're looking for people usually with mental health issues and so on, and they're funneled in, trained to be suicide bombers. They make no difference. They're not really important in the movement. They are used, but you can see how well organized they are when they have this figured out. Then you need a lie. A lie basically is there to motivate a mob. You need a blatant untruth designed to produce a level of outrage that destabilizes the kind of ancien regime. It justifies violence, and it keeps supporters in their dependence on the new regime as the sole source of truth. And a lie is usually told to justify violence. We know that even from the Bible. The first Christian martyr, Stephen, it was a lie that set his martyrdom into operation. So, for example, in ISIS, they had violent jihad is the obligation of every Muslim. That's nonsense, but it worked. We are invincible because God has enabled us to build paradise. A Muslim who is not of us is not a Muslim. The West will never act against us. It is too weak. Well, eventually the West did, and they're gone. But that took 6 years. The strange rule of an effective lie is that if it's so bold and so blatant, you make it so that everything that happens subsequently confirms it. For example, in India, when Grange Staines was burned to death with his 2 sons, and this was 1998, I think, there was great outrage, but the Hindu extremists had put the lie out that essentially the West is trying to take India over, is trying to impose the Christian faith. And so when this happened, you would think they would be on the defensive. Not at all. Their whole point was, see, why is the West so upset about this martyrdom? It shows that their agenda has been exposed. So everything then, if the lie is bold and big enough, everything subsequently confirms it. That's a bizarre way it is. A mob, I must hurry up here. A mob is an unorganized group. They can break the law, they commit violence, they create kind of careful chaos. I've given this quote from Savartha Sopater. He was a man I enjoyed interviewing, well, sort of enjoyed interviewing. He was so Javanese that you would have an hour with him and he might just give you half a sentence that was worth quoting. But he was the head of the Protestant churches in Indonesia when there was a lot of church burnings, in particularly Surabaya. And I interviewed him, and all he would say after about half an hour, he said, "There are actors." That's all he would say. And then I got him to say, well, you know, what kind of actors? Intellectual actors. But what he means is that a mob is never spontaneous, really, in practice. A mob needs to be fed, a mob needs to be bussed, a mob needs to be armed with machetes or whatever. It's very rare to have spontaneous violence. It's always organized, almost always organized. And there's that famous phrase, I don't know from whom, but it's very smart. It says it's important to ask who pulled the trigger, but it's even more important to ask who paid for the bullet. Because if you want to figure out who's driving the mob, they're never in the mob. They're always in the background. ISIS targeted the mob, and they were very specific in targeting particular types of young men who were lonely, misfits, wanted to matter, young men who just wanted to love violence, young men who just wanted to have sex. They used them all. They were able to have a very good recruit, because a mob, you're just really using people. They're getting them excited with a lie, and they create chaos. And then finally, you need, well, not finally, but secondly, you need, second from last, you need a megaphone, I just call it. It's basically manipulating the methods, messaging methods are manipulated to ensure the extremist narrative becomes dominant. Other sources are either shut down or discredited. I talk about the tactics of surround and suppress. Surround means you make the narrative omnipresent. You can't avoid it wherever you are in society. Suppress simply blocks access to the other points of view. And that can be, of course, in different ways. When ISIS, for example, came to Mosul, what was the first thing they destroyed? It was the mobile phone tower. That was their first act of destruction, because they cannot allow you to be receiving other messages from outside the caliphate. And there's a new book out actually called Spin Dictators. It's by Sergei Guriev and Daniel Treisman. The Changing Face of Tyranny in the 21st Century. Interesting book this, because they're kind of arguing that a dictator doesn't need to necessarily get rid of all of democracy. They just really need to handle spin. And spin is the way they subvert a democracy. So that's their argument. I wanted to quote to you from a chap called Arkady Ostrovsky. He's actually the economist journalist for Russia. And he has a very interesting book, The Invention of War, but he talks about this business of a dominant narrative. And he says, the Bolsheviks began by taking over the printing presses and guarding their monopoly over printed words. Words were used to conceal facts and construct the alternative reality. Lies and repressions were the two main pillars that upheld the Soviet system. Words justified repression, repression enforced the words. It worked like an arch. The Soviet Union expired not because it ran out of money. After all, it could have turned into North Korea, but because it ran out of words. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrestled with the Soviet system, knew there was only one way to defeat it. Live not by lies, he wrote on the day of his arrest. The paradox was that the opening up of the media could be achieved only by engaging in half-truths. When reality burst through that opening in the form of live television broadcasts and uncensored publications, the Soviet Union crumbled. So then he goes on to talk about, well, how does Putin do this? Well, he takes Putin's strategy, he says, is to quash civic space by creating what he calls hermeneutic noise, so that you can't get to the truth. For example, you have an explosion in Russia, which he has arranged, but it justifies his attack on Chechnya. But then everybody's running around, what really happened? What really happened? He's creating hermeneutic noise so that you actually can't get to the truth. And that's where he thinks that Putin is particularly clever. The ISIS megaphone, we've talked about it. I mean, what people don't realize or forget about ISIS was that they terrified everybody through their superb use of social media. I mean, this was an organization who had a total control of messaging through places like YouTube, Facebook, and so on. They got them all on those platforms. And this is when Al-Qaeda are sending out cassettes from Afghanistan. That's how different, that's how clever ISIS were in using megaphone. And of course, the idea was really that we've got a successful caliphate. God's on our side. We're coming for you. We're going to shed your blood. And this was this drumbeat. And that's why so many people ran away, because they had such a bloodthirsty message. And then finally, laws. Laws are a little bit later on, probably because, you know, the extremist needs to be in power to kind of embed their ideology into the social fabric. But there are advantages to this, because laws can last a long time and they can be hard to unpick. In Pakistan, for example, there's a blasphemy law. And lots of people want to change it, including Benazir Bhutto, but it was first passed in 1974, and it's still on the statute book. It's quite difficult to get rid of a law once it's passed, even if regimes change. Legitimacy, it looks kind of legitimate that you're saying, well, you know, it's not a religious freedom issue, it's a criminal matter. And so you do the law differently. For example, in China, this is very cleverly done. For example, December 30th, 2019, Wang Yi, who's the senior pastor of the Early Rain Covenant Church in Chengdu, he got 9 years. But why did he get 9 years? Here's the charge: inciting subversion of state power and illegal business operation. Now, in actual fact, he was a pastor who just happened to be in a house church. But no, the way they had figured it out was they had laws designed to call him a criminal. And that plays better in the international sphere. And then, of course, ultimately, laws do shrink our boundaries. They shrink our social space. The classic case of this is the blasphemy law in Pakistan. Here it is: use of derogatory remarks spoken directly, written directly or indirectly, defiles the name of the Muhammad or other prophets. Mandatory death sentence. Trial must take place in a court of session with a Muslim judge presiding. Now, in actual fact, no Christian has ever been executed under this law. But here's Asia Bibi. She was accused under the law. All you need to do is accuse someone and they end up in jail. And they are years in jail. She was 9 years before an international campaign released her. But the whole point is, the law is there to shut Christians up. 6 million Christians are afraid to speak out on anything religious because of that law. It's not measured in terms of, well, nobody's been executed under the law. That's not the point of the law. The law is there to discourage people from speaking out on religious minorities anyway, and very effective in that regard. Responding to all this, so if this is an understanding of how persecution gets going and how it gets worse in a setting, what do we do about it? We're in an interesting phase right now, because the word advocacy has really changed its meaning quite recently. Advocacy used to have a very particular use. It was a noun, and it was the act of pressuring the persecutor to grant more freedom, especially of a legal nature, to an oppressed minority. You go to a government and you say, we would like to add this into the blasphemy law. For example, what they did was they said, can we add another clause into the blasphemy law which says in Pakistan that the person who accuses someone wrongly then has to face consequences? And that was that's the kind of advocacy that we used to talk about. But increasingly, though, advocacy is simply used as a general verb. Well, we advocate, we work on behalf of the persecuted. So whether you're taking Bibles in, whether you're doing any teaching, it's all called advocacy. And of course, you have these advocacy campaigns now, which I would say don't really have, some of them anyway, don't really have a hard edge to them. They have no real criteria to measure success and failure. I was looking at an India campaign recently from an organization that shall remain nameless. And all they're basically saying is, we'll take these concerns to Mr. Modi. That's it. That's about all they're saying. Does Mr. Modi care? You know, but of course, an advocacy campaign is very important. There's millions of dollars at stake in this, because an advocacy campaign increases what is called donor agency. People like to feel like they're making a difference. I'm signed up for that. I'm going to make a difference there. And the other is younger generations are very activistic and they love a campaign. And this is very often how I'm afraid you get assigned. So addressing the two great problems, Wang Mingdao and Thomas Farr, what I have found is I've taught this stuff around the world to Christian leaders in persecuted settings. There are two primary problems that always present. One is, on the whole, and this is not to do with this, Christian leaders, I would say, in persecuted settings, struggle to have the time to get to know God. I remember sitting down with leaders of churches in China not so long ago, before COVID, and they were probably over maybe 10 million members. And they said to me, almost privately, they said, I haven't got even the time to read the Bible. I'm so busy maintaining this firefighting. And I said, I'm preaching a sermon that I had 20 years ago. I haven't got the time. to go and get to know Christ. And Wang Mingdao, of course, he was one of the great leaders. Tom Harvey has a great book about Wang Mingdao. And Wang Mingdao always said that he was unimpressive as a Christian leader until he went into jail. And only in his cell did he get to know Christ. And of course, the whole challenge of Wang Mingdao is how do we build ourselves a cell, especially if we're not pushed into one. But it's that idea of making time to get to know Christ. But the other big problem, I would say, that emerges, and this is understandable, I'm not complaining about this, is that most Christian leaders in persecuted settings struggle to get the concept of structures. They are always in a setting, usually, where it's individualistic. If you thrive, if you convert, more people convert, culture gets changed. It's nonsense. That's not how cultures change. And J.D., who's the guy who wrote To Change the World in 2010, what was his name again? J.D. Hunter, brilliant book, where he basically shows that if you look at the history of Christianity, culture change is accomplished by elites, overlapping elites. Yes, there is such a thing as bottom-up change, but it's not decisive. And the problem with basically making it so individualistic is that it's always your fault. You know, the culture hasn't changed because you're not holy enough. And this is, and Thomas Farr, interesting man, he was interim leader of the unit in the State Department. He wrote a very good book called World of Faith and Freedom: Why International Religious Liberty is Vital to American National Security. He's just a diplomat, really, in the State Department. And he really complains about this. He says, you know, when we were looking at Afghanistan as a State Department, he said, we focused all our energy on getting one man out of jail, a Muslim background believer who had been accused. And of course, you know, it was important to get him out. But he said, we sat by while a new constitution was drafted that baked in the most radical exclusion for generations. And so his idea is that even in the world of advocacy, even sometimes in government, they're not getting structures, the structural dimensions right. So that's why I tried to use the 7 elements as a way to try to get the structures back into play. And I get the people who are on this course to do this, map it out for themselves. And then, as I say, we have this process where we say, okay, everybody has to shrink the vacuum. That's the most important thing. But then, if you shrink the vacuum, where are you in the area of, you know, are you, if I was a journalist, for example, I would probably be called to deal with megaphone, because that would be my area, messaging. If I was a lawyer, I would deal with perhaps laws. If I was in the political sphere, I would probably focus on the villain, because, you know, high-ranking legislators can often get to meet the villain face to face, that kind of thing. And so, you know, we come up with a strategy. This is where it's at. So I wanted to wonder, you know, where does this go? I mean, I'm trying to bring this up to a more academic level, because you can bounce around the world teaching this to people. But if you're working for, you know, a ministry or a big ministry, essentially, you know, we have to admit, everybody's always paid to listen to us. Everybody's paid to listen to us. And, or sometimes you turn up and of course you're the, you know, you've come from, you know, London or wherever, you've got this degree, you've got that degree, so they turn up. And you say, well, how does you think, you know, what's this, how does this work? Oh, it works marvelously, thank you. Oh, it's tremendous. You know, you don't get really hard, well thought through responses because of politeness, whatever, the dynamics of the thing. So I'm interested in seeing where this should go. How does one make it more robust? Does it have predictive value? Of course. You know, I actually remember speaking at a forum in Washington, D.C. in January of 2020, and I said very strongly, I said, this lie that Donald Trump has told, that the election is stolen, will not change the system because there is no underlying vacuum that supports it. And sure enough, that lie went out there, but the judiciary held firm. And there wasn't a single legal case where they said the evidence is here on this bar, this election was stolen. And that included 60 judges that he had appointed. So there is some predictive value from it. I just hope from this that that Christian leaders, you know, develop the same smartness in some ways as their enemy. I used to go from speaking to Advani, a wonderfully shrewd man, and the advantage of having a journalistic career was that you get kind of like a lawyer, you get a kind of backstage pass to the corridors of power. And I would go from Advani to the leaders of the Indian church, and I would think they have no idea what's coming for them. This is a man who's thinking in 50-year increments. And so we need to, is this a useful tool for the leadership to become as smart as our enemies, not in a nasty way, but in a way of, you know, wise as serpents, as Jesus says. There was a wonderful man called Professor Fong. I won't talk about Professor Fong. I think I'll stop there. I'll stop wittering on because it's already getting on, isn't it, Tom? So I'll stop there, but please give some help to this, even if it's just privately afterwards, to come and suggest how I can take this on, or even if it's worth taking on. That's what I'd like to know. So thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Ramak. We're going to entertain questions, comments, and that will begin the process. Go ahead and stop sharing. And go ahead, and if you want to ask a question or make a comment, at the bottom there's a reaction button. Yeah. You can press on that, and then it'll say raise hand, and you can
stop sharing.
The red button.
Okay, let me begin, as I always do with these things.
Oh, yeah, right at the top.
Yeah. It's really interesting, Ron, because the kind of things you
what book?
Oh. Over there. Okay, all right. The kind of things that you were addressing and how individuals make difference. At least as I heard those were very interesting, because each of them in a way touched what fills a vacuum and at least form some firewalls against that. And that's civil society. Because when you look at a reporter, he's not just a reporter, he represents something called the fourth estate. So one of the things that you always try to do is remove any kind of opposition press. So, you know, you said you knocked out whatever you do is you try to stop a different message coming in. Or if you're a lawyer, you're part of a legal system. All right. So the judiciary forms a part of civil society. I think one of the things that we've often lost is that the church is part of civil society, that it represents a firewall and a power, if it will use that well, to help fill a vacuum, even when it's disempowered. And I think in some ways, the Chinese church has done that in certain ways, sometimes more effectively, sometimes less effectively. But one of the reasons why Wang Yi's removed is because he was a group of several pastors who were beginning to establish footholds of speaking truth to power. So one of the things that I just want to emphasize as a step, but one of the things I'd lace that with a criticism of evangelicals. Evangelicals are notoriously opposed to civil society, and that I've found. We're so individually focused. We're so focused on the individual soul that focus on civil society is seen as a distraction from our main cause, our main purpose, that kind of thing. Also, either that or we line up with one party as we see as a savior of all. That's equally bad. But what I don't see is evangelicals going into the press, going into the media, going into law, going into the secular academy, as they say, well, it's hopeless. It's everything's hell in a half basket. But I really do see those are the institutions. Now, as one who's lived in China and one who's lived at the university, you better go on with your hard hat on and be ready to go. But anyway, that's just my comment. You can respond to that, Ross.
Yes, I mean, the issue for me, Tom, very often is this a model for how persecution creeps into a culture, or does it work for a situation where the extremist is already in charge and has been in charge for a very long time? For example, I would argue that China today can be understood in terms of a defining vacuum, which is that the party basically said, at the four modernizations in 78, we'll make you rich, but the price is you shut up and you accept the total authority of the CCP to control everything. And what that resulted in was that as they got richer and richer, the country got more and more corrupt. People got fed up with materialism, and also they got frightened by the fact that there were no real values left. And so this is in fact what Garfield is arguing, that the church will always win out in this battle, because the Chinese Communist Party can only wag their finger and say everybody needs to be a lot more honest, but nobody believes them because they're talking from a moribund ideology. The state, the church has something that works. And as Professor Fong used to say, this is the man who basically died in the early 90s, but he said, the Chinese church will continue to grow after Tiananmen Square. He said, always look for a miracle, always look from revival from a massacre. And he said, you will find that it will be an organization versus a movement. The CCP is an organization. The church is a movement. And there's no contest. The movement always wins. And so he was right. This is really how it is playing out. So I'm wondering about extending the understanding to almost more stable situations where you can still see where a vacuum is, because societies are always, in flux, aren't they?
Yeah. Kyle, go ahead, unmute and ask your question.
Thank you so much for the very interesting lecture. I'm involved in some global advocacy work with the World Evangelical Alliance, and I noticed your background with the International Institute for Religious Freedom, which I believe has links with the WEA. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the Institute and how they sort of function in this sphere, and anything else you might want to say about that.
Yes, it was set up by the WEA. In fact, it is still under their auspices. The chap who's leading it now is actually Dennis Petrie, but he's in very close contact with Thomas Schirmacher, who of course comes from this area of religious liberty. It was basically set up maybe 20 years ago. I can't remember the actual date, but it was to gather together people who were somewhat involved in academia and to put religious liberty or religious freedom on the map and bring a kind of robustness into the area, so that it wasn't just really people, doing campaigns, people writing press releases and so on, but there was some kind of scholarship emerging. And certainly when I was in charge of an outfit, I used the International Institute for Religious Freedom rather, as a body that validated what we were doing, our research. But it doesn't have a huge funder. Nobody's paid really, except Dennis for a bit of time. So I think it probably needs to get a bit stronger. Christoph Sauer, Thomas Schirmacher have been its mainstays for many, many years, good people, and real stellar light in the world of thinking in a more robust fashion about religious liberty. So that's still the kind of idea. It's a think tank on religious freedom, and it uses the WEA network to distill that.
Al, go ahead.
I can't thank you enough, Dr. Ronald, for your extraordinarily important, for me, and for those of us that see Chile, Latin America, where I come from, as a possible test case of exactly what you are talking about. Surprisingly, in 2019, 18th of October, there was an uprising, a Gramsci style and then Leninist style revolution burning, and took us totally by surprise. And the entities that produced that vacuum, people rushed to the extreme left or the extreme right, and the middle classes didn't know what to say. My question to you is, in this whole issue, how does the church overcome the lie? Because truly, there is a lie abroad in Chile that is incredibly difficult to overcome. You're either blackened. I myself have been very involved with this process from the evangelical point of view. As you know, non-Catholics are called evangelicals. Catholics have been silenced because of their own moral dilemma in their own church. They hardly dare speak. But evangelicals are not. We're a tough bunch, but mostly evangelicals are not politicians. We're a church movement, as you say. So we speak very much, conservative, right, abortion, etc. But we have tried to come into politics more, and we have actually found, to our amazement, that they can't really overcome us, okay? But how do we, 3 million of us, 20% of Chile, overcome the lie? I mean, there's a lot to be said about how churches, the fall of the Berlin Wall, etc., how much the church was involved. That's my question to you. How has church moved as a movement, because we're not politicians, to overcome the lie? You've already said something, but I'd be fascinated to hear from you, because you've got me gripped about Chile, if you've studied it.
I would need to do more study on this, because as I've looked at the situation in other settings, not a Latin American one, I have to confess, it's not really been the church that that contests the narrative. Because the church on the whole, especially if it's an evangelical church, this alludes back to what Tom is saying, is really quite internal. Look, it's very conversion focused. And this would require a kind of wider lens that is not there necessarily in an evangelical way of looking at the social system. So very often, though, the church designates certain major people to get out into the sphere and contest the lie. Christians in the media would be very, very significant. Even someone like, maybe the most significant Christian in the Soviet Union was Solzhenitsyn, with his publication of the Gulag Archipelago, where he just created a body of evidence from the camps that just couldn't be explained away. And of course, it did help that he was super connected. He got the Nobel Prize. That doesn't come to everybody. So he gained a power, out of proportion to the normal writer. But if there was a case study of how well that was done, I would think it would be someone like. But I mean, there are occasions when a major Christian leader can speak out very successfully. I think Desmond Tutu, possibly, in South Africa, was quite powerful. Now, he came from a liberal Christian perspective, but he definitely spoke out against the lie that was driving apartheid. And then he was equally strong in speaking out against the lies that were being put out by the ANC that, you know, we have the right to govern this way, you know. And he said, no, no, you have to be held to a moral standard. And he was a fierce critic of Zuma and the whole concept of state capture, which was not really being covered enough in the press. So I'd be interested to work with you, Alfred, on trying to find a set of models that we could say this is how it gets done successfully, and maybe more thinking on what needs to be lined up, you know, to make that happen. Because if it's just a lone voice, then that can be shut off, or if it's one channel, it can be stopped, you know. So there needs to be a concerted attempt there to contest the narrative. But in the West, certainly the way our governments are dealing with Islamic extremism is primarily in this area of contesting the narrative. But very often, I mean, what we found, I remember being part of a unit that was in Iraq after the American invasion, liberation, whatever you want to call it, in 2003. And they thought that they would present their perspective to the people through the media. But they had no idea that actually the way you consume information about what's going on in society is by going to the mosque. And you listen to the man up the minbar. And he gives you the grid through which you interpret. So for example, there was a bomb of a Jeep, an American Jeep. 3 men from the States, from the army, were killed. Now you would think that people would say, you know, the Americans are making quite a sacrifice to help us out here. Oh no, the way it was presented in the mosque was the Americans blew themselves up to justify staying here longer so they can grab the oil. So there was a complete misunderstanding of what the megaphone was that actually created the way people had an understanding of what was going on in society.
Thank you. Very, very helpful. Very helpful. And Latin America is a case where conversion, as you well say, that kernel you gave, conversion does not necessarily mean change. Massive conversion in Latin America, but societies continue the same. On the other hand, as we train up political leaders bit by bit, then it seems that there's a chance.
Good, let's go to Tim.
Just a minor point of history before I get on to my proper question. Hyperinflation in Germany was in 1922-23, rather than immediately before the rise of Hitler. It was the Great Depression that created the fertile ground for Hitler. But one of the things that's true, I think, of all these persecution places, as it were, is that there's a kind of layering of society. So you can condemn somebody. So let's take Nazi Germany. You could condemn somebody because he was a Jew. You didn't have to know whether he'd murdered anybody. I mean, they did some wonderful films. Goebbels did some films showing viciousness behavior by Jews. And so by implication, all Jews were like that. But it was quite enough for the German, for the Nazi authorities to say, that man is a Jew, therefore he is bad. He is to be persecuted. And you get the same in other places, like in the Ukraine. If you're a kulak, that was enough. You are off to the gulag, and so on. So if you can just label people into layers rather than asking whether this person is a good or a bad person, you can do any amount of persecution almost with impunity. So I think there's an important aspect is this layering of society.
Yes, yeah, no, that's a very helpful point, Tim, because you know, if you tag someone with a particular identity and they're beyond the pale, then there's no way they could ever present a contrary narrative, and that's job done. Yeah. In many ways. If you look at how Modi has worked in India, he has basically, the lie that he produces to get into power, to get into amazing power in 2019 actually, was to basically say the Muslims are coming for us. I will protect you. Only I can protect you. It was very messianic, but he has created a situation where, well, Muslims, they would say that, wouldn't they? You know, so you have, you know, 200 million people have lost their voice in a sense in the public sphere. So, and there must be a process to that that's very clever, because the Goebbels approach was different, wasn't it? Goebbels basically had the theory that you must tell the lie all the time, every day, 1,000 times, 100,000 times a day. You know, it's the battering. And whereas I think that's harder to do now in an internet age where there are other points of view. So maybe the labeling is quite effective. Yeah, very good.
I think
keeping-
Goebbels was good at doing it indirectly, though. That's why he used film. So he just set up a kind of indirect labeling of Jews, whereas some of the Nazi officialdom wanted it to be much more blatant. But he understood the value of converting people behind their backs, as it were.
Yes, yeah, there was subtlety there. Yeah, he wasn't just a blunt instrument. Yeah. In fact, that's one of the great things I think we've got to deal with here. Our enemies, and maybe it's the wrong term, but the people who are strategizing to bring the church down are incredibly smart and organized, and if I think sometimes the extent to which they had thought about things and what their plans were shared, Christians might waken up more to the fight that they're in, because very often they're not aware of the extent to which, you know, a Modi or an Advani or a Xi Jinping even is plotting to take their power away. And I always emphasize in persecution, I think, theologically speaking, I think the enemy is trying to make us grow cold on Christ as the ultimate goal. I don't think the enemy necessarily wants to eradicate the church. It's actually quite a helpful thing to keep a nominal church in place, because then it looks incredibly unimpressive. But the actual spiritual goal is to make Christians go cold on Christ. And that's where the enemy has their smarts that we need to be aware of and be working, you know, in response to.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much for the very insightful talk. I'm from China, and I have many words to say, I bet, in this respect, because I'm doing a project on Chinification of Christianity, which, in my view, is a tactic to suppress, to persecute the church by distorting the truth of Christianity. Yesterday, I received an article from the Lianghui, which is the highest Christian organization of China, and it is it reported on the activity taking place in Shandong province, and the opening line is as Christians of the new era, we should be grateful to the CCP and listen to the party and follow the party. See, if you change the word, shouldn't Christians say we should be grateful to Christ and listen to Christ and follow Christ? But now the party has kind of supplanted Christ, and this is not a command from the government. This is a saying from within the church by the church leaders So I'm quite disillusioned with these leaders. Yes, there are faithful leaders like my pastor. He has under such oppression, he has a tactic, he has a principle that on minor things, we can be cooperative with the government, but on major things, which is related to our faith, the truth of the gospel, we cannot agree with them. But these kind of pastors are very few, if I should say so. So how, I'm very glad that you mentioned Wang Mingdao, but we only have one Wang Mingdao, or a few such personalities. But my question is, how do we Christians, Christianity in China generally count on these leaders if we are to stand for our faith, if we are to stand against this persecution or oppression? Well, do you
Yes,
have any suggestions?
I don't have the solution in a nutshell. Perhaps there isn't one. I hope there isn't one anyway, because it wouldn't be that simple, would it? But I take your point that there is a new situation, probably since 2019, with the publication of those requirements in February of that year, which is basically what we call the partification of Christianity. It used to be that Christianity was allowed, but it had to kind of serve in a general way the party or the social system. But nowadays, the church is not allowed to stand out on it, to stand aside. It has to promote the party line. And that's what's, the last 3 years have been a bit unusual on that. I don't know. I always see, there's a lot of samizdat now going on, underground sharing of what people really think. And so, I do know a pastor who has his sermon and he preaches it to the CCTV and it goes to the party and, it gets checked and all that kind of thing. And then he submits a text around everybody that is completely different. And he says, well, this is the real sermon, and that's dangerous, but it's possible. And so I think there is and also there is this attitude. I come across it a lot. I was talking to Tom last week about it. A lot of Chinese Christians have read that book by Shusaku Endo called Silence. I don't know if you've read it. It's one of the great novels, basically, of the
Silence. Okay.
Silence.
By whom?
Shusaku Endo. He was a Japanese novelist of the 20th century.
There's a film.
There's a movie about it that Martin
Yeah.
Scorsese made, and there's
Yeah.
another one from earlier on. The movie's not very good, but the book is very interesting because it contains this bizarre, some would say dreadful idea, some would say it's an interesting idea worth entertaining. Essentially, a Jesuit goes there, he's persecuted. To save the lives of Christians, he stands on what's called the Fumi, which is the face of Christ, an icon of the face of Christ. And he's reluctant to do it, he would rather die. But when he does, in the book anyway, the face of Christ speaks back to him and says, trample, trample. It's for this that I die. And so you have this complicated idea that you can outwardly apostatize while inwardly obey.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, I can't sit in the Cotswolds and judge, on what a Chinese Christian who might be, a lot of Chinese Christians belong to the Communist Party, And they were asked to sign a covenant recently to say that they were not a believer. And they all signed, but on this basis, that I have my private, my private faith is my own. And there are areas here that are interesting. It's the person who stands up, makes a fuss, and really speaks truth to power, if you like, the Solzhenitsyns. They are vanishingly rare in any culture, I would say. But they, perhaps because of that, their words do take on a power that is remarkable, and even from culture to culture.
Yeah.
Samuel, go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you, Ronald, for your presentation. It was fascinating, encouraging, interesting. I'm originally from Pakistan. My dad was a Muslim convert, and my brother was martyred years ago before I had to find refuge. So, I mean, the topic of persecution is very near and dear to me. At the moment, I'm in Chicago teaching at Moody Bible Institute. I think I'll just limit it. I'll just kind of focus on Pakistan, and I know that you have good relationships there in LCT and others. What LCT is doing, Lahore College of Theology and Bishop Marshall, I think is a wonderful example of existing survival yet passionate proclamation. And I think maybe some other time you can elaborate on that. What I mean is this: I think I really was encouraged for your focus on the Word of God. I mean, in the US, there's a lot of advocacy groups and all those things. But frankly, most of these groups have limitations. At least, let's say in Afghanistan and Pakistan, you cannot go and challenge the government of Pakistan and the laws. Yet on the other hand, my question is this: how can people, let's say in UK, OCMS and others, even in the educational institutes, how can we even bring this topic with the reality that legally we may be limited, but biblically and ethically there is a role for us to play? Maybe I hope that I'm trying my best to make a little bit more clear. Legally we may be limited, of course. You cannot, whatever. You cannot, as we said, we cannot challenge. Even though you try your best to challenge the blasphemy law, you're not going to get anywhere. But do we give up, or could it be a role for our Western friends who are in freedom? We live in free countries. Then what could be the role of a Western church to empower the brothers and sisters in those, persecuted countries? Let's say Pakistan and Afghanistan. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. No. It's a great question. I'd love to chat with you more and more about Pakistan. Of course, there's so much in that culture that fascinates me, and I don't know. You're absolutely right in that this is what this man, Professor Fong, said after the Tiananmen massacre. He said, you must do a type of thinking that we can't do in China. Keep the picture really broad. And this is how East and West will come together. He said, you'll see more from your vantage point that we can't see. And I remember, not really quite getting him at the time, but he was open to the fact that you could do something for me that I can't do for myself. I then discovered, when I was a journalist, particularly I met the Pope, the Coptic Pope, Shenouda, not the present one, Pope Shenouda, cunning man of God. And Shenouda was interesting because if you took him to a human rights conference, he would say anti-Semitic things and he'd get sent home. And that's what he wanted, because that looked good for him in Egypt. But what he would say to me is he would say, Christians are being persecuted here. You have to tell the story. I'll turn around and criticize you for telling the story, because I have to live here. But you have to tell that story in the belief that underneath, I'm really applauding you but publicly I'll be criticizing. And so I thought, well, that's rather a thankless task, but he was right. There were things that could only be said, from London about what was going on in Cairo that cannot be said there. And so I do believe in an interdependence and very often it's specialist skills. Now we see it, of course, in the world of advocacy much more easily with lawyers. There are all these organizations who are saying, we are talking to, Imran Khan, or we're talking to, the new Prime Minister of Pakistan, and so on. And they are, and that's their particular speciality. And of course, they can leverage sometimes some very powerful individuals in Washington, to make calls and get people free and that sort of thing. The Asha Bibi case is classic. But I still think there is this deeper need to say, yes, but it's not about cases. Keep the picture big and broad. And what way are we trying to change the culture? Because is our basic goal to try and make a culture where the knowing of Jesus Christ is hospitable on a daily basis? I think that's really what we're trying to do. That's the best way to survive persecution and thrive even through it, is when that kind of culture is created. And when the focus is too much on the case or the law, I think that gets lost a little bit and needs to be, recovered. Yeah.
Kyle, go ahead.
I have a question. Yeah.
Thank you. Oh,
Go ahead, Kyle. And then is there someone in the room who wants to ask a question?
I have a question.
Okay, we'll do Kyle and then we'll go to the room. Okay.
I'm just curious if you could comment on, just from your perspective, what kinds of research or things that the students of OCMS could contribute toward. What do you see are some of the global needs as far as that goes related to this area?
Well, I think there's a great dearth of study on persecution, specifically, I would say. And I think the biggest gap is in the historical side of things. How do churches die? We've had this massive focus in missions on how do churches grow. And so you've got these characteristics of a growing church and so on. And the big question, Paul Bender-Samuel is very good at pointing this out, are they prescriptive or descriptive? If you have all these 10 characteristics, does it automatically mean you're going to be a growing church? But Philip Jenkins wrote a book called The Lost History of Christianity. I think that's a very important little book. It's not terribly well written. And he, like a lot of his books, he dashes his books off very quickly. But I think he does it to sort of say, okay, follow me into this. And he takes a look at how churches go extinct. And that, I think, is probably of a single area I would want some scholarship in. I would want them to look into the theology and the historical story of how do churches die. A theology of church extinction, as Jenkins puts it. Though where you're going to get the funding for that, I don't know. Everybody wants to study church growth. Nobody wants to study how churches die. Try finding a donor interested in helping that one along.
Let's go to the room. Ron, any questions there?
Thank you for the talk. My name is Douglas. I'm researching on mission higher education in Pakistan and looking at some of the colleges. During my research, when I was looking at the nationalization brought about by Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, so one of his advisors, Maulana Kausar Niazi, he advised him, similarly as you just mentioned, that take away education and help from Christians, and then you will see where they go into society. And this has actually happened in Pakistan. They nationalized the educational institutions, they nationalized the health services which were being delivered by Christians, and the level of Christians did go down, and then it's still recovering.
Yes, yeah.
And I work in Forman Christian College, which was.
Oh yes, of course, I know it well. I drive past it when I'm in Pakistan, going to LCT.
Again, raising the standards of Christian community and the image that people have of Christians.
Yes.
So just wanted to mention.
That's very good, because it shows how long-term and effective the thinking is. You know, I mean, when did that push out of with the taking over the education? That was way back in the 71. I mean, look how long-term that is and how effective it is over that length of time. Yeah.
Has in fact now government is trying to take control of.
Yes, we have another. Yeah. Oh.
Ron,
Yes.
when the person is done, repeat the question so we can hear here.
Oh, okay. He wants. Can you hear him all right?
No.
Oh, I'll repeat the question then, probably. Okay, come over here. That's fine. Yeah.
We heard Douglas pretty good, but yeah.
All right, this is a question from Nigeria. All right, I'm very enlightened by this seminar. It's been very enlightening, and the exposure is great. Now, I want to ask you two questions. Number one, built by what before bricks? I remember in 2010, while I was in Nairobi doing my master's in intercultural studies, we came across a 25 years plan on Islamization of West Africa. What? At that time, Boko Haram was not prominent, but there have been 25 years document, which was dated back to the ruler Gaddafi in Libya. And now Islamic organization will be sponsored to carry out the Islamization of West Africa. It was just very mild. We look at those documents and we had some studies about it, but we did not take it serious. And now in Nigeria, it's a real issue. More than 2,000 churches have been burned down in the north. And it is almost forbidden to go back there to replant those churches in strategy. As I'm talking to you now, in southern Kaduna, that is basically Christians, there is a deliberate eradication of anything called Christianity, and people are being killed. And yet our church leaders in Nigeria from the south, we seem to be dormant in terms of action we have to take. Nobody is doing anything. And with what you have said now, I also discovered that the current regime in Nigeria is part of agenda of Islamization of Nigeria. Yes, the current government is an agent of Islamization, because the tribe from the Fulani, they will specifically say that they are going to Fulanize Nigeria, that it belongs to their tribe. And recently, the Fulanis kidnapped the prelate of Methodists in Nigeria. It's no longer a news. And they got a weak government, like you mentioned, incompetent government. nothing is ever done. Nobody is ever arrested. Nobody is ever tried. And Islam, once it is done for Islam, the people at the top government level, like the judiciary, they are Muslims. So they won't talk at all. And what can we do in Nigeria in this situation? Then again, you also mentioned, number two, I want to ask, the current Islamic revival globally, is it not because of reverse mission, the vacuum created by the global north that makes the Islam to travel, to thrive in the global south?
What do you mean by the vacuum?
Vacuum in global north, yes, the less involvement of the global north in mission is a vacuum.
Secularization.
Secularization is a vacuum that makes the Islamic tendencies in the global north to arise and take up the world, because it's not longer an activity in the global south, it's coming to different parts of the world. And currently here in United Kingdom, immigration is a loophole for the Islamic participation, even in politics in the UK. And nobody talks. Today you find that it is democracy. Those who have high numbers in Birmingham, you see mayor becoming Muslims, you see Muslim, there's a lot of other areas that are penetrating into certain areas because of vacuum created. That is the vacuum.
Yes, that's fascinating, because you know, how would you apply this 7-element structure to the West or to Britain? And there are quite a lot of books on this, which are diagnosing why our society is so weak at being able to resist some of the ideological winds that are blowing. You know, the big thing that we're facing really in Britain is particularly this, talk about built by words. Remember the whole idea that I can declare myself a woman. I can declare myself trans. I can declare my, you know, in a sense, we half agree with that, because the world was created with words. And of course, this comes through this French, you know, Derrida, Foucault, where everything is discourse. Reality is defined by the words that are used. So we are facing in our society this whole question of, well, how do we defend ourselves from people simply saying, well, I am this, I am that, and you have to tolerate me. And so there's some thinking about this. Rod Dreher wrote an interesting book called Live Not by Lies, and he talks about this in America, the USA. There is quite a lot of writing on this in the States. It's all over the place, though, you know, in terms of where it comes from. And but there is some good stuff in there about why are Western societies so unable to repel this idea that a human being is what you declare it is. You know, that's the, how do you stop somebody who says, well, I'm no longer I'm a woman. I may have a man's body, but this is who I am. That's coming from French philosophy. And the thought very often is, how do we say back to this, yes, but biology matters. You can't just say I'm a woman and not, you know, take your, you know, biology seriously as an empirical fact. So this is the fight that we're having in this society. But is it enough of a fight in the face of what you're talking about? You know, somebody wrote in the Times recently, he said, you know, Putin was moving into Ukraine while we were talking about whether to have gender neutral toilets. You know, where's the focus going? And are we dying on a small cross, you know, rather than a big one when it comes to this? So there is a lot of stuff on this. And I mean, the cultural capture idea is very important. I've really reread with great profit this book by J.D. Hunter to change the world. He's a Mennonite. It's published by Oxford University Press, 2010. And he basically argues that if you look at the history of when Christianity takes over a culture, it is always an elite activity. The elite capture cultures, and overlapping elites particularly. You know, I heard somebody say, we can all be a William Wilberforce. Can we? And William Wilberforce was a personal friend of the Prime Minister. Are you a personal friend of the most powerful person in the land? Well, Wilberforce was a member of the Clapham sect. 20 people who were some of the richest people in the land. A philanthropic group which basically bankrolled everything he did. And Hunter basically says, if you say, well, go out and be a Wilberforce, you're asking somebody to go out and it's a job description the ordinary person cannot fulfill. Because we do have to accept that when it comes to cultural capture, it's an elite activity. Now, it doesn't mean that there is not, I think Hunter, you know, underestimates the bottom-up element of cultural change. You know, Martin Luther King is an elite figure. He speaks for civil rights in the USA. But he needs 250,000 people on the Washington Mall to respond to I Have a Dream. You know, so it's not that the ordinary person doesn't play their part, but it is an elite activity. And that's one of the things that Hunter is basically saying, you know, get real about how cultures change and realize that, you know, the Jesuits had no problem with this. When they went to a society, they set up the schools and they decided to train the elite of the next generation. That's how they did it. Education was the key for them. And they've been around 400 years or so. They invented mission, the word anyway. So I think this is a useful concept. It plays into this evangelical aspect that we're putting. I think one of the reasons why I find a lot of leaders in persecuted settings so tired and so strung out is because it's all up to them. It's their fault that the culture has not changed because they're not holy enough. And that's a dreadful situation to be in. Oh, terrible.
Well, with that, I will step in and we'll time to tie a bow on this, but they're very good. I think, Ron, we need to look at a Montague Barker lecture that goes more into this. I can't stop and add one other book to the mix, which pushes back a little bit on that last point. And that is a book I recommend because a lot of you were touching on it. And it's actually an essay written by Václav Havel called The Power of the Powerless and his concept of living in truth. And what he says, yes, elites do make a difference in terms of their different roles within society, but common people do too. And the nice thing about Havel's Power of the Powerless is he tells vignettes after vignettes of common people who began to disentangle the lies in ways that revealed the lie for what it was. And it was that led to the Velvet Revolution that ended up with the collapse of Gustav Husak and the Czech Soviet Empire. But one of the things that's really interesting in that is that it was a velvet revolution and a very interesting that it has impacts through time. So if you're looking for something that has a handle on it, what's interesting about Havel did not see himself as a Christian, but when he started looking for models, he went back to the Czech Brethren movement. He said they're the ones that understood it. And I've found that true. Even people like Liu Xiaobo in China, he looked to the house churches. And the one thing is, you mentioned Liang Hui. Liang Hui is, from my understanding, a minority of Christians in China. Liang Hui does not represent the great bulk of Christians in China, and not even the intellectual ones. There's all kinds of intellectual Christians who are in non-government Liang Hui churches. So Liang Hui means two two group, which would be CCC, TSPM, Lanhui, two meetings. But the house churches still dwarf them. The family churches still dwarf the official churches. So there's still good faith in China. So it just brings us all joy. Anyway, I will end it with that. We have a really good tape here. I'm going to get this out to other people. Thank you so much, Ron. Just fantastic talk. So have a good afternoon. So bye-bye.
Thank you.